Okay, and we're up and running and recording. So today we're mostly focused on dyslexia. What is it? What are the characteristics to look for? How do we define dyslexia? And I'm going to start with a student story. So way back when, I had a student by the name of Alicia. And Alicia was a fourth grader, and I was a special education teacher. So Alicia had an IEP for reading, all the above, reading, writing, math. And Alicia came to me onto my caseload mid-year. She had moved in. I was living in Washington at the time, and she had moved in from the state of Texas. So no one knew Alicia. We didn't have really any background on her at all, but she did come with a really, really big paper trail, like much bigger than usual, even for special ed, and special ed is known for a lot of paperwork. So I got this massive file of paperwork, and you start sifting through this stuff, and I thought, I'm just going to put this down and get to know Alicia as a young girl and as a learner. So she came to my class, and I found I started working with her and gave her some screeners and reading and writing and spelling. And I could see where she was at on her IEP, but I kind of wanted to get some fresh data for my own knowledge, for my own self. You check and verify, right? Excuse me. And, what I found with Alicia is that she was reading at a pre-primer level, pre-kindergarten to kindergarten as a fourth grader. And in working with her on reading, I realized that her strategies for sounding out words were not to sound them out, right? So you probably know kids like this. They'll try anything possible to get a word read without having to sound it out. And this was before I had learned about dyslexia, before I had any training in Orton-Gillingham. So I found her characteristics of her reading or symptoms really peculiar. She'd constantly guess at words by context clue or picture clue. She'd try to predict words based on the shape of the words or the size of the words or a similar word. So after I got to know her a bit, I started going through her paperwork, her file, and I'm looking at years and years of documentation, and I'm finding, wow, she's had like almost every reading intervention that's pretty, common to give under the sun. She's had SRA, Reading Mastery Plus, Guided Reading Plus, lots of different interventions. And so she also had a behavioral point sheet. And this is what made me a little bit nervous about working with Alicia. When you get a student with a behavior point sheet, you think, okay, well, what are the triggers going to be? How am I going to work with this student? How am I going to motivate them? And, additionally, Alicia was also diagnosed with autism. So, she had a lot going on. Despite all of that, she was a lovely young lady. She could talk, very eloquently. She could tell an amazing story with a lot of description, great vocabulary. And, it really struck me. And, I had only been teaching maybe 3 years at this point, 3 or 4 years as a new teacher. It struck me how amazing she could speak, with her oral vocabulary, but how horribly she could read. She couldn't read at all, but yet she had a great vocab. She could comprehend anything I read to her, but she couldn't comprehend anything she read to herself. Of course, because she couldn't read the words on the page in order to comprehend. So long story short, I didn't know how to help Alicia. So I called in the reading specialist, who was at that school nationally renowned. She spoke on a national level for her expertise in reading. And I said, you've got to observe me. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I'm not getting any movement out of Alicia in terms of reading progress, and I need some tips. So she came in and she observed a lesson and observed another lesson, observed another lesson. And I met with her afterwards and I said, all right, give it to me. What am I doing wrong? Or what do I need to use differently? And she just looked at me and she said, well, you're doing everything right, Kel. just keep at it. And developmentally, she's probably just not ready yet. I thought, oh my gosh, it's not the answer I'm looking for. She's in 4th grade. Her intelligence is intact. You know, she's got good vocabulary, decent comprehension when she's listening. So I really didn't get what I was looking for when I brought in my reading specialist expert. And we're going to fast forward the story. I'll tell you the end of the story at the end of the presentation. So I continue to work with Alicia, and I'm trying to figure out the rhyme and the reason to her reading errors. And these are the common error patterns I noticed. You know, I noticed she was substituting words, synonyms, okay, for like meaning words. She was changing endings on words quite a bit. So suffixes would change, or she'd drop off suffixes. She was skipping the little words, like the ands, the buts, the ises, does, are, how. She pretty consistently got her vowel sounds all mixed up, the and then she wouldn't be able to tell when a vowel should be long versus short versus schwa, something in between. Her reading was slow. The reading that she could do was slow. It was choppy, and she had no clue how to sound words out. She did have her letter sound correspondence. She couldn't sound words out though. I found that she had memorized the majority of the books we were working through. You know, she would figure out how to memorize those low-level books, and she could probably fool someone into thinking that she could read at a higher level than she could because she was smart. She was compensating. So our agenda today is to look at what dyslexia actually is. You know, what is the most commonly accepted definition of dyslexia? What are the characteristics of dyslexia? And I'm sorry I didn't have time today to send you this PowerPoint through email. I had all intentions of getting it out, and the day it was so back to back, but I will send that to you later tonight. I'll send you the recording as well, probably tomorrow. And I'm also going to send you a couple of resources that you can use as reference sheets in the classroom or in your school in terms of looking for developmentally what are kind of the signs and symptoms you look for in K through 2 students, 3 through 5 students, 4 through 6 students. I'll send you another resource too about dysgraphia, characteristics of dysgraphia. So you can't talk about dyslexia without talking about dysgraphia just a little bit. And that's the writing end of things. So we'll discuss a little bit of the writing stuff today. We'll take a look at cognitive resources in terms of overload, you know, when the brain is on overload because it is compensating. And we'll also discuss just real briefly how instructional methods that are chosen make a big difference. And that'll lead us into our 3rd day next week, which will be all about methods and strategies, you know, how to work with kids who have dyslexia. And we will save some time for Q&A at the end today. So we'll have 10 to 15 minutes afterwards. If you have questions, just jot them down. So since you're attending a session on the science of reading, you know, dyslexia in reading, you're probably going to guess what the #1 reason is for reading difficulties. I led you right to it. It's dyslexia. A lot of people are really surprised at that, but it is the #1 reason for reading difficulties. And if you think back to last week's presentation, when we went through the whole list of reasons why students might struggle with reading, and then we had another slide that said, you know, when it all really boils down to is 3 different reading profiles. You know, we have a profile of a decoding needed kid, a student with decoding needs. That's your dyslexic profile. We have the profile of a student with mixed needs, so your comprehension and your decoding. And then we have the profile of a student with only comprehension needs. Of those 3 student profiles, the #1, 8 out of 10 times, your students are going to struggle with reading because of decoding. All right, this can get complicated because if left unnoticed, not having the right type of intervention or supports in place, guess what? It can snowball into a lot of other issues. Big one being comprehension, anxiety, mental health issues. So, the key is really identifying what's going on early on, getting the right type of intervention so that we can stop the snowball, from causing more problems. But dyslexia does not cause a problem with comprehension inherently. This is the most commonly accepted definition of dyslexia. This one is adopted by the International Dyslexia Association, which is what IDA stands for. It's also adopted by the National Institute of Child Health Development. That's what NICHD stands for. There are other definitions of dyslexia. When you look at like the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and you start comparing definitions, this is the most widely accepted. So this states that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. So it's usually inherited, it's genetic. It runs in families. Most often, parents find out one of the spouses is dyslexic when their kids are diagnosed. And that's actually what happened in my family. My husband had no idea he was dyslexic until our daughters were both diagnosed. And we went, okay, well, where did this come from? It's quite enlightening, and it answers a lot of questions when parents figure out just why their the processing of information is different usually. So dyslexia is also characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and poor spelling and poor decoding. So I've got those three characteristics. I don't know if you can tell, they're kind of bolded and grayed out, because those are the three most common characteristics for people with dyslexia. If you're dyslexic, you have problems with accurate reading, you have problems with spelling, and you have problems with your fluency. And by accurate reading, I mean sounding words out. The trick to this is, what gets tricky is that dyslexia occurs on a continuum of really mild to moderate to severe to profound. So when you think of, if I make a comparison to autism, autism occurs on a spectrum. It's a spectrum disorder from mild, moderate, severe to profound. And we used to use the term Asperger's to describe a very high functioning person with autism. Well, dyslexia is very much similar. You could have dyslexia so mild, you don't even know you have it. And it's usually often what happens with parents, but then they might have children who have dyslexia and it's much more severe. Or you might have a parent or an aunt, uncle, grandpa who has dyslexia that's very severe, but then their children inherit that dyslexia, and it's not quite as severe. Maybe it's in the moderate range. And it's last I looked at the research, it's a 1 in 5 chance, so 50-50 chance of if a parent has dyslexia, passing it on to their kids. What's important to take a look at in this definition is that these problems are unexpected when you relate it to their intelligence and having good classroom instruction. So this isn't a curricular disability. It is hardwired in the brain. It's a brain difference. And it's not a cognitive disability either. You can be brilliant and be dyslexic. You could also have low intelligence and be dyslexic, or just average intelligence and be dyslexic. There's no correlation between intelligence and dyslexia. All right, so we're spinning back to those 5 components of reading instruction, just briefly here. I showed you Scarborough's reading rope last time we met, and same 5 areas here, but I'm highlighting this phonological awareness piece, because this is what research shows us is core and causal in terms of creating problems and havoc in a dyslexic's world. Dyslexic persons have phonological processing problems that can be taught and built up, amongst other things. But that is the big one. Prevalence of dyslexia, when you look at the literature, a lot of literature states 1 in 5s, which would be 20% of your general population. It's huge. It's a huge number. This research is all over the place, comes out of one in particular is Yale University has got a dyslexia and creative thinking center. Dr. Sally Shaywitz, she is a really well-known author on the topic of dyslexia and researcher. She authored Overcoming Dyslexia, and she has found the 1 in 5 number to be accurate. Other organizations will quote 15%, 17%, 18%. So it's right in this pocket. It's the upper prevalence estimate is 20%. The lower is 15 to 17. So I would like to relate this back to the classroom. You know, if you have 1 in 5 students that are potentially some level of dyslexic, you know, that's a lot of students in a classroom of 20. It's what, five kids? My math brain's not on right now. Forgive me if I'm wrong about that. You know, you get in a company of 100 people and that's going to be about 20 people. So dyslexia affects probably most of our families in some way, shape, or form, whether it be through relatives or colleagues you work with or friends. So let's do a quiz. This will be fun. Let's test your dyslexia knowledge. We're going to do some myth busting here, but maybe there's some facts. I'm not going to tell. I'll read numbers 1 through 5 and we'll see what you think. Is it true or is it false? So number 1, dyslexia is when people see words and numbers backwards. What do we think? Does anyone want to give me a thumbs up or thumbs down? Anyone know? Okay, Anne Marie, Jerry, you're right. Incorrect. Okay. Yeah, persons with dyslexia don't see things backwards. Of course, that would be like a superpower if they could. It's not a vision issue at all, but is a directionality confusion. So they will retrieve letters and numbers facing the wrong direction, but not a vision problem. Number 2, developmental reading disability is different from dyslexia. Might have to think about this one. What do you think? Is this true or false? If anyone wants to do our thumbs up, thumbs down, go right ahead. I don't know your name, but I see a thumbs up down at the bottom of the screen here. Okay. Anyone else have a differing opinion? Okay, this is false. This is false. I'll tell you a quick story. Dyslexia has lots of names: developmental reading disability, LD in reading, decoding specific. I think I have a slide that names all the different names of dyslexia coming up, but I was a classroom teacher. Again, I was teaching special ed. A student I was working with stopped me if I shared this last week. 2nd grade students. Family had a neuropsych eval done. They gave me permission to call the neuropsychologist and collaborate. So I did. Did I tell you this story last week? Please, no? Okay, good. I'll keep going. So, you know, I'm talking to the neuropsych on the phone and I read through the whole report, and man, it described my student to the T. His diagnosis was developmental reading disability. And so I said to the psychologist, well, I see the diagnosis, but don't you think he shows a lot of signs of dyslexia? And I'll never forget his reaction. He says to me, well, of course he's dyslexic. Did you read the report? And I went, oh yeah. I mean, I did read the report, but you didn't say the word dyslexia. So In the medical world, these terms are used interchangeably. You'll get neuropsychs that diagnose dyslexia, but they're going to call it a developmental reading disability, or they're going to call it a learning disability of the decoding type. And there's a few other names it goes by. They're just not retrieving right now as I'm talking. So technically, these are the same thing. Number 3, people with dyslexia have lower intelligence. Of course, we just talked about this before. This is false. Number 4, more boys are dyslexic than girls. What do you think? False. Good. False. Prevalence is the same across the genders. 5, kids can't be tested for dyslexia till they're 8. You know, 3rd grade hits. A lot of kids are referred for special ed in 3rd grade. It's a big year. Anyone know about this one? This is false. Thanks, Jerry. False. Kids can be tested for dyslexia as young as 5.5. They can be screened for dyslexia as young as 5. So there's a lot that can be done really early. Anyone have 100%? Yay, Anne-Marie, Jerry, awesome, great. Maxine's got a question, then why don't they screen that early? Well, that's a great question. That's a great question. Maybe we can talk about that more at the end of the presentation today. So here's the paradox, right? We do have a problem, and this feeds right into the question that was asked in the chat. Reading problems usually aren't identified till about 3rd grade. Yet the optimal time for intervention is KN1. That's when that neuroplasticity is the best, the most flexible and most agile for learning. So this does present an urgency to screen for dyslexia at a really young age. And to use what science of reading has showed us works best for the brain, which is that orthographic mapping, which is based on that Orton-Gillingham approach, or structured literacy-based approach. This is a resource I'm going to share with you through email. It has a front and a back. This is just the front side. The back side goes 5th through 12th grade. But it's a good one. It's a good one for teachers to just have as reference, to share with parents. This would be a good one just to have out in the hall next to your school office. It's going to create a lot of conversation though, which is a good thing. But what you want to look for are clusters of symptoms. You know, so if a student were to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 of these issues, and look in their past, you know, if they're a 5th grader, look through the preschool, kindergarten years, check off what they had, look through the 1st through 4th grade years, check off what they showed, and then look at your 5th grade years, and look for clusters, because these symptoms, when clustered together, are indicators that the child may have dyslexia. So the rest of this presentation, I've really taken just kind of like the really big picture symptoms or characteristics of dyslexia. You can fine tune it by using this resource, but we just don't have the time to go through everything on that resource. But we do have the time to go through big picture characteristics. So think umbrella. These are the big things you're going to notice. Trouble with phonemic awareness. As I said before, phonological processing, so phonemic awareness is under that umbrella, is core and causal when it comes to dyslexia. It creates problems with reading, decoding, sounding out new words. It creates problems with spelling, which then creates problems with writing. And if the reading doesn't get help soon enough, it generally leads to comprehension problems. A lot of, you know, sometimes persons look at this list and these characteristics, and they go, okay, well, what do we use for the big kids? What do we look for, in our middle school kids and our high school kids? This, so this you'll see characteristics of this across the grades. It'll start with difficulty at the word level, difficulty segmenting a word into sounds. But that segmenting can move up to syllable segmenting, right? So maybe a child has dyslexia, they're behind in reading, they finally figure out how to segment, single syllable words, but when they get to multi-syllable words, they can't hear the syllable breaks. That's a phonological processing problem. Phoneme deletion, can they take a sound off of a word or a syllable off of a word? At a low level, I might say the word table. Now say table, but don't say what's left. Okay, can they come up with able? And that's the initial, the front end of the word. Can they do that medial? Can they do that at the end of a word? Can they match sounds? Or are they having difficulty knowing which sounds are the same, especially your short vowel sounds? Persons with dyslexia have difficult time discriminating between your it, they're all very similar. Can they count how many sounds are in a word? So you take the word tough. Think about this. So how many letters are in the word tough? As in, that was a really tough hike that we just took. Got T-O-U-G-H, so 5. But how many sounds are in the word tough? So 3, 3 sounds. So oftentimes, persons with dyslexia have a really big disconnect between the letters in a word and the sounds that those letters make. Phoneme substitution is another one. An example would be, say the word bake. This is a low-level example, but now say bake, but change A to E. What's your new word? Beak. Blending. Oftentimes, this is unexpected. Oftentimes, you'll see kids who know all their letter sound correspondences, all the basic ones, 26 letter sound correspondences, maybe even some more uncommon correspondences. They got their vowel sounds down. They can say each sound in a word that's phonetically regular, but then they go to blend the word and they say something completely different. And so that is a breakdown of phonological processing. Rhyme. In a young student, you're going to see difficulty with rhyming. So these kids usually don't like nursery rhymes. They don't like rhyming because it just confuses them. They really don't get it. They don't know how to rhyme a word. Interestingly enough, I read a little bit on rhyme, and I've read that rhyme is a good screening tool for young students, but it's not a good teaching tool in terms of over teaching rhyme and over focusing on rhyme isn't the most important aspect of phonemic awareness. You really want to focus on your segmenting and your blending. Those are the two really, really big ones. Okay, secondly, another big picture characteristic of dyslexia is probably not what you'd expect. It's rote memory. And this starts from young and moves on to older students. And you might see trouble in young students remembering the ABC song. Maybe they have to sing the song in order to say the ABCs. That's kind of a good way to test it. Can you say your ABCs without singing it? They have a hard time remembering letter names and sounds. I just worked with a young student today. She was 8 years old, and she had no idea what her birthday was. No clue. She couldn't tell me the month she was born in, the date. Of course, she didn't know. The year, she definitely didn't know. Bright young girl, but rote memory issues. She couldn't remember how to spell her last name either. 8 years old. So all of these things you might see, other everyone's different. So everyone's an individual. So I certainly don't want to leave you to believe that every person with dyslexia has all of these characteristics. Remember, you're looking for clusters. As kids get older, you're going to see problems usually with multiplication facts, and when they're younger, they're doubles with addition. They can't remember their doubles. But yet you give them a piece of paper or a whiteboard, they can figure it out. They can do the work. 5 times 7 is 5 groups of 7, but they can't just retrieve it quick. This is why kids with dyslexia have such a hard time with sight words too. They'll get the word, I don't know, was, and they'll read it 3 different ways on 2 different pages of text. So really anything rote can be really difficult for our students who struggle with dyslexia. Characteristic number 3, of course, this is part of the big definition, is your decoding and fluency. I use a brick wall picture here because for a dyslexic reader, words are like a brick wall that really, they need to be deconstructed each and every time they get to that word, until it's memorized, until it's mapped in the brain. A brick wall is, if you imagine a real brick wall, it's made of individual bricks. They're all mortared together, and you would need some serious power tools to blast apart those bricks and get the mortar off the bricks. Similar to words for dyslexics. Oftentimes they hear a word and they hear one big sound, one big amorphous blur. They don't recognize that words are made of individual sounds. And if they do, and it's maybe more mild form of dyslexia, at a larger level, they might not hear syllable breaks, which can really impact spelling. So this is why so many of our students who are left undiagnosed or unscreened, I should say, they guess at words. They're using context, they're using picture clues, they're using anything they possibly can to read words on the page without having to read words on the page, because they don't have that neurological wiring in place. That highway hasn't been built in their brain for decoding until they get the correct instruction. Fluency is the other end of this. So our students with dyslexia have slower fluency. Their reading can be real choppy, and you can get fluency to be pretty smooth for most of them. But oftentimes it won't get perfectly up to grade level. Like if you look at the Hasbrook and Tyndall norms for oral reading fluency, they're kind of the gold standard for oral reading fluency benchmark norms. If a end of 5th grader is supposed to be at, I don't remember, 100, I don't know, we'll say 120 words. If you have a student who's dyslexic and they're reading at a 5th grade level, great, but their fluency is around, 80 or 90, you know what? That's great. That's great. As long as they can comprehend what they're reading, you can work on that fluency and try to get it up higher. But the fluency issue is inherent in dyslexia, and sometimes it's one piece that doesn't always iron out perfectly. But you do want to get them to a point where they can comprehend what they're reading. I think I skipped one here. Hang on. Okay. Yeah, spelling. Spelling is a big red flag. Really poor spelling doesn't come without a reason. You're not just a bad speller just because you're a bad speller. Bad spelling comes from typically a learning disability, either of the reading or the writing kind. And if you're dyslexic, you're probably a poor speller. And these are the types of spelling patterns you might see in a dyslexic writing sample. You'll see missing syllables, oftentimes the middle syllable's missing. You'll see vowel sounds confused. Silent E sometimes just kind of sprinkled all over the page because they're not real sure where silent E goes. So they're trying to see what looks right. The big thing with dyslexic spellers is they're trying to spell by visual memory. And science has proven, research has proven, we just can't do that. There's just way too many words in our language to memorize every single spelling of every single word. They've got to be connecting the letters with the sounds. So they have to have their phonetic patterns down and their spelling rules down. So you'll see a lot of these characteristics. And I'm going to show you a writing sample here from a third grade student. This student was an early third grader, not dysgraphic. I mean, the teacher gave her paper without lines for some reason. Maybe this was a free write, but I mean, really pretty legible handwriting, but you're going to see some of the telltale signs of dyslexia in this writing sample. Trouble with high frequency words, phonetic spelling, silent E confusion, and you're going to notice a bunch of flipped letters in the wrong order. So if you look at the second line here, we've got the word owl with the W and the L flipped around. And then we've got girl spelled as grill. So the R and the I are flipped around. We have one other flip with her. So her is spelled twice, H-R-E. Where I'm circling here. And then just in general confusion over, silent E, because grump E, well, she's using silent E to get the E sound, but silent E it's not called silent E for no reason. It'd be talking E if it said something. That's always my joke with the kids. That made some of you laugh, I hope. But so, these are all really very, very typical spelling patterns you're going to see in a younger student. Words they've seen for many years already, a few years already in school, hundreds of times, and they're being spelt wrong, like the word because. It is a big word, but by third grade, usually kids have that word down pat. Her also is another one that's a really common word. Once, they often see the once upon a time in stories. And you would think they would at least have that O in place, but this is very, very phonetic. So if you can't tell dyslexia by reading, you can usually see it in their writing. Another thing I wanted to bring up, not everyone with dyslexia has trouble with auditory discrimination, but some students do, a very small percent do. And I always like to bring this up because if there are too many problems with auditory discrimination, that's hearing the difference between really similar sounds. So like j, ch, sh, ch. Do you hear how similar those are? Very, very close. If there are too many of these issues, it's going to cause a mess for reading and spelling progress. It's just going to be so confusing for these kids. So, if this is a problem, Linda Mood Bell, the LIPS program is probably the best program for plugging holes in auditory discrimination and memory. But, there are other programs that you can use. If you're familiar with the Birch text, what is the name of that book? It's a basic simultaneously language teaching, but it's by Judith Birch, B-I-R-S-C-H, I believe. She has a whole section in her text, which is often used in college courses, on how to teach auditory discrimination. And if the kids can't hear the difference between these sounds, you can't teach it through the hearing mode. You've got to teach it through the feeling and seeing senses. So, you literally have mirrors out, and this actually works beautifully if you're teaching remotely online, because a student can see their face, in the webcam, and they can watch what their mouth and their tongue is doing, in that webcam. So you're training them to feel the difference. What are the lips and tongue doing? when you say j, and how is that different from ch, and so on and so forth. So just a quick plug for auditory discrimination. If there's too many issues, they're going to really not progress very well. Characteristic number 6 is writing. There's a lot of overlap between dyslexia and writing, especially with spelling being really the common denominator between our reading and writing learning disabilities. So you might see issues with mechanics, fluency, organization. You might see dysgraphic type tendencies where pencil grip is incorrect. They're forming letters with all different start points. Spatial awareness might be just not there. Their margins might be floating around. Words might be floating up off the line. They might have huge gaps between some of their words or letters, inconsistent slant. But in general, you're probably going to see some problems with writing as well. Look for oral expression, and compare their oral expression to their written expression. If there's a huge disparity between the two, that's an indication that there's a learning disability going on. Here's an example of a dysgraphic writer. This student, they're writing about the author's craft. I can't remember what grade they were in. I want to guess they were around 5th or 6th grade. But the other's craft, so others should be authors. And so they're not hearing that awe, nor do they remember how to spell author, which is a more common word. But you can see, problems. The first thing you notice is it's hard to read. Their number one is flipped backwards. There's no capitals, really, no punctuation at the end. Spelling is all phonetic. Letters are flipped around. So the common denominator between the writing disability and your reading disability is your spelling. And let's take a look at that. Real briefly, let's look at dysgraphia. Just like dyslexia, dysgraphia is a Greek word. When you break these words down, they define themselves. So dys indicates that there is an impairment of some sorts, and graph means writing. So ia is a condition. So difficulty, the condition of difficulty writing is essentially what this means. So it's your writing disability. Whether we call it dysgraphia or not, that's what it is. SLD in writing. And here's a little chart I always like to show. There's a high correlation between students with dyslexia also having dysgraphia. But when you look at the two learning disabilities, the common denominator is spelling. So spelling's always a problem with a student who has dyslexia, but it's often a problem for someone with dysgraphia. Not always, but often. So I have another resource for you. I'll include in my email. These are the characteristics of dysgraphia. And you're going to see 4 big picture characteristics at the top. You're forming letters, numbers, and words. You're spelling. You're organizing written information from memory. And you're getting words onto paper through writing. It's that the brain paper connection. I've got it up here, but can you get it on the page? And oftentimes that is just the trickiest thing to work with. I encourage a lot of collaboration with your OTs in your building. If you have a student who you think has dysgraphia, talk to your occupational therapist, because they're just a world of knowledge when it comes to dysgraphia. Here's a writing sample, student who had dysgraphia. Some things to notice. Okay, the margins are floating off the side of the page. We've got letters flipped upside down. So that should say Lego. The E is upside down and backwards. We got high frequency words spelled incorrectly and capitals mixed in where they shouldn't be. Your K is capitalized, your B is capitalized. Oftentimes when students are confused about directionality, like B versus D, they'll use a capital B or a capital D because they know which one to use then. And you're going to notice, more flipped around words. Instead of is, they have SI. Right above that, they have I. That's not capitalized. In third grade, all third graders should be capitalizing their I's as a proper noun. This slide I borrowed from a presentation that was given at the IDA state conference. And I just thought it was so fantastic because you could really apply this to any learning disability or any struggle a student has. If you look at all of us having a certain finite amount of cognitive resources to use throughout your day at school or at work, right? You've got this gas tank, and when your gas tank is empty, you can't give any more, you can't get any more fuel out of that. And if students are hyper focusing on spelling, if you look at this bottom chart, children with dysgraphia, they're using a lot of time and attention to try to get words spelled correctly. Look what happens to the time and cognitive resources they have to devote to the other areas of writing. It's all diminished. So your content, the meat of what you want them to be able to relay, their knowledge and their learning, they have only so much energy left for that. Whereas if you have a child without dysgraphia or without dyslexia, they have way more resources to devote to content construction and sharing their learning, because they're not thinking about, how do I spell the word because? What does that word say in the first place? I can't figure out how to sound it out. And they're not hyper focused on their handwriting trying to be legible. So it's just, being aware of that shift in resources. It's very taxing on our students, and they definitely do need some, oftentimes, extra support. Extra time is what I wanted to say, extra time to complete tasks and supports. All right, so I'm going to try my best to finish up on time here. So I put in some slides here on executive functioning skills because it's all so related. If a learning disability, then yes, we're probably going to have some issues with executive functioning skills because it impacts literacy development. I like Dwyer and Gossen's research model on executive functions. They quote 11 different executive functions. There's no one agreed upon definition of this, but this is a really nice way to organize it, define it, and think about it as a teacher and as you're working with your students. I do work with kids. We do have small group work on executive functions at my reading center, and I also just did a PD on executive functions over at a school in West Bend. So if you're in need of information for your school, you can contact me about this, because it's fun to talk about. It's kind of fun to teach. Some examples of how executive functions affect literacy development. Working memory is huge, 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 huge. How many of you have had a student who can say all the sounds in a word, or can break each syllable apart, say each syllable correctly, but as soon as they go to blend it, they don't have those sounds anymore? That's a working memory issue. Some of auditory memory, some working memory. It's as if the sounds disappear as soon as they look up from the word. Well, so that you coach them, keep looking at the word, blend it while you're looking at the word. And sometimes that helps, but sometimes it doesn't. Sustained attention and language organization are major areas that affect literacy development. Language organization you mostly see in writing samples. So, syntactically, does everything make sense? Does it flow? Are the words in the correct order? Are they using pronouns correctly? Things like that. Metacognition is the whole essence of executive functions is metacognition. Metacognition is really the ability to critically think about your choices. So thinking about your thinking, does this make sense? So if a child is reading a passage orally and you're listening to them read and they read 2 words wrong, 3 words wrong, 4, 5, 6, 7 words wrong, they have 8 errors and they haven't even noticed. They're just buzzing through the paragraph. They have no clue they're reading words incorrectly. That's a problem with metacognition. The fact that they're not pausing to ask themselves, wait a second, is this making sense? Are the words I'm reading making sense? Because you can get away with a couple mistakes usually, but too many mistakes and you're not going to comprehend what you're reading correctly. So it's bringing some self-awareness to the students so they realize when things aren't making sense, or maybe when they're getting off track. Metacognition is a big life skill. A lot of these skills aren't fully developed until our mid-20s. And so that's another piece of executive functioning skills is how do you support kids at school who their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, so they don't have the skills necessary, but they're also delayed, have these learning disabilities or other coexisting conditions. And it can get tricky. It can get really tricky. Flexibility is another very important skill when it comes to decoding and spelling. If you try one strategy and it doesn't work, you've got to have that critical thinking, flexible thinking to be able to go, okay, well, if A doesn't say A in this word, maybe I should try a schwa sound, okay? And once you try that second sound, boom, you got your word. But if you're not flexible enough to think on the spot, what are my other options? What do I need to try next? You run into a roadblock. Other variables are going to be processing speed and storing and retrieving information. It's kind of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Some days are going to be better than other days. And in fact, some days can get really rough. This is an actual student in a classroom, and he was having a really, really bad day. Dyslexia is lifelong. Dyslexics can learn to read, a lot of them up to grade level, but symptoms will be exacerbated. You'll see things creep up and problems happen that haven't happened for a while when you're not feeling well, when you're overtired, or when you're really stressed out. Adults will tell me this all the time. Professionals, they'll say, gosh, I haven't flipped my B's and P's around for years, but today I was having problems with it writing, and you know what? I've been really stressed out. So that was, that can be a trigger. So this will lead us right into next week's presentation, which is all about instructional methods. And when you look at your science of reading and what it says in terms of how the brain maps words to meaning in order for accurate and quick retrieval, that's called unitization. It's all saying explicit and logical, cumulative scaffolded, simultaneously multisensory, and very systematic. You've got to have a logical plan. So we're going to go through these next week. And I did want to share a quote that really resonates with me. This is from the Overcoming Dyslexia book with Sally Shaywitz. She says, in an era when we can image the brain as an individual reads and literally see the brain at work, it's unacceptable to have kids and adults struggling to read when they could benefit from what modern neuroscience has taught us about reading and dyslexia. And that is all I have for you today. So my job tonight is to send you the handouts and the resources I promised you, and I will do that shortly. we have time for a little bit of Q&A here. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Anne Marie.
So my first question is, should all kids with dyslexia have an IEP?
No, I don't think that would be appropriate. I think students with dyslexia still need to meet the eligibility requirements for special education. And that's a loaded question. If special ed isn't always the answer for a student with dyslexia, it depends on the severity. It depends on what kind of training the teachers have. If they're going to offer something that's not going to move the student in terms of progress, then special ed is not the right answer. Yeah. Oftentimes, students with dyslexia really benefit the most from, in my experience, 504 plans.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
Okay.
It really depends on the severity. You're welcome. Anyone else have any questions?
I have one other.
Yes, I love questions. Go ahead.
How do you address, so in our school, when we start the RTI process, we have what's called a SIT team, a student intervention team with, the core people working with the child. And at what point do you address dyslexia could be a possibility with the parent of a child?
Well, I would be giving you my personal opinion on that. Yeah, personal opinion is immediately as soon as possible. Because that parent.
People seem to cringe when you bring that up.
Do what?
They seem to cringe when you bring that up.
Parents do, or the
parents and fellow teachers, like it's almost like don't say that until you have a neuroscience diagnosis, or let's not bring that up, because it's almost like telling some of my colleagues view it as if you would say to a student you suspect has ADD, that telling them they need to get to the doctor for medication, or they just like.
So it sounds to me like a lack of information and education, right? It's cringy to hear if you don't know how to help it. Yeah. So if you're telling parents dyslexia and they're going, okay, well, school, what are you going to do for us? Well, and if you have nothing for that and you don't know how to help that creates a real problem. It's really kind of a conflict of interest. So I see oftentimes schools don't. I'm sorry, I think I have a dog issue here. Okay, I think they're good. Don't often use the term just because they're not equipped to, work with it. But gosh, hiding that from someone ethically just it's not right. If they could go and get
service. And that's how, I agree with you. I feel like that. And we did have a SIT meeting the other day, and I did bring it up. It was after our class last week. And I felt like a few people thought, well, you're not a doctor, so how can you be so sure?
Well, if you take a look at what's interesting is if you take a look at our country as a whole, a lot of states have dyslexia legislation in them. So take, for instance, Texas, they have been screening for dyslexia for years already, very young age. I think they start in 4K or 5K. And they have teachers trained in Orton Gillingham methods, and they have individualized dyslexia plans that are different from special ed. And, I really feel that's the pathway we're going to have to get to eventually.
And are you going to give us some ideas to use some screeners?
I was not, no, that's actually not part of the workshop here.
Okay.
But there are some nice screeners on the market right now. The Shaywitz screen is nice. Dr. Sally Shaywitz has got a nice one. Nadine Gaab, Gaab, she's got a nice screener that was been published. She's out of, I think, Harvard University.
Well, maybe I'll email you and just for some of those resources.
Yeah, you should, because there are a lot out there. And, the term dyslexia, it's this like misnomer, right? People don't understand the term quite often. But a decoding disability is dyslexia.
Right.
And so there is a mismatch between the medical field and the education field. Like we need to build this bridge. If dyslexia is a decoding issue, and we have SLDs and decoding in our schools, then we have dyslexia, and we know how to work with dyslexia, well, then why aren't we using that information to help our kids in our schools, right? That's
Can
kind
we
of
use Sound Partners? Are you familiar with Sound Partners?
no, I'm not. I've never used Sound Partners.
Okay. It's
Yeah.
very Orton Gillingham relate, like they're cousins, I would say.
That's good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Kelly, maybe I can jump in and help here a little bit from a
Yeah,
director
please do.
standpoint, from a director in a district. If we were doing a screener for ADD, then I think it's fine for us to, for example, tell a parent that the student might be identified through that screener. If we're doing a screener for dyslexia, I think it's fine if you're doing that screener to share the results. Let's use some other mental health examples though. I don't do a screener for mood disorder. I'm not going to tell a parent that I think their child has a mood disorder. I might tell them that I think they might qualify for maybe an emotional behavioral disability, and there might be some struggles around some of that. Could we take a look at that? So I think part of the reason you're getting the reaction you might be in the district you are is that if you're using the word dyslexia, which is a medical diagnosis, the learning language we use in schools is reading disability, which includes dyslexia. Now, again, if I do a dyslexia screener, then I think it's okay to share that. I think that's the difficulty. We use the word dyslexia in IEPs, we use it in 504s, but usually that's coming from a diagnosis from an outside provider. If not, then we're usually talking about a reading disability. You might say they show some characteristics of a student with dyslexia, but the thing that might make your school cringe a little bit is that that's not a criteria that we, if you're not implementing a screener, that you would be qualified to share. You might say they have some tendencies that
Which is
could
what I
resemble
said.
dyslexia, but
Yeah.
you have to do that very cautiously. And I think part of that is where's your district system at? Because as you shared, Kelly, in the previous discussion, there are some districts that are doing those screenings. I know that we brought into De Pere, we have a screening that we are able to do to kind of look at where students fall in some of that. And we did bring in some Orton Gillingham based interventions to make sure that we have a continuum, which also kind of references what Kelly talked about the last time. Just depends on where your system's at and trying to move that system forward to meet the needs of all learners, yet in doing so in a way that might not cause difficulty for you as an employee.
Thank you.
You said that beautifully, Jerry.
Yeah, there's ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's ways to push the system and to
Yeah.
have the conversations. And I know that's what you're trying to do, Anne Marie. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, I'll be very honest to say I was at UW-Madison at the time when Kelly, I don't know if you're familiar with Sarah Tarver, who was there. She was a big direct instruction advocate in the special ed department. And then at the same time, you would be in other parts of the special ed department that were teaching nothing but whole language, and we're preaching that. And if there's one thing I think we all know as special educators, there is no silver bullet that meets the needs of all kids, which is what I really appreciated, Kelly, about the last session, when you showed the continuum and the needs and figuring out where it lines up with kids. Because we all know that we need a little bit of everything as an option so we can have the right thing for the right kid at the right time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I can't wholeheartedly blanket a statement and say one particular program is going to work for all kids, but it really does come down to their needs and matching their needs with really a continuum of methodology is what I found works best.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I never was a fan of whole language.
Yeah, yeah, no good. Kelly, do you have a question?
I was talking recently with my literacy coach in my district, and we were just, or her kind of question was, the Orton Gillingham, is that something that should be used more with the reading interventionists or saved for special ed instruction? Because we are doing screeners in our district that are kind of, red flagging the kids that do have these tendencies. And we want to start using the intervention, like the Orton Gillingham, but they're not sure if, what then the special ed teachers would use to differentiate their learning.
That's a super good question too. I guess it comes down to the needs of your students. Your students in working with your reading specialists, all closing the gap and making the progress you'd hope they do. Or could they use another tool in their toolkit to maybe help some of their students?
And Kelly, my answer would be as well to add in with Kelly, to kind of support the decision is if you only have it in special ed, then you're going to have a push to have every student who potentially gets diagnosed with dyslexia to be serviced through special ed. And I think Kelly mentioned earlier, that's not the answer. So what we have done in our district is push to have it available to students through our interventionist and through special ed. Now, I think the difference is our parents in special ed probably have a little more voice at the table in the process in terms of they don't get to pick, but certainly have more input. Whereas I think sometimes with our interventionists, it's more of what have we deemed as kind of those levels that will support. And there are some students, and Kelly, you stated it well when you talked about severity. There are some students who I think are diagnosed with dyslexia, but are having a fair amount of success. And they don't necessarily get marked in a tier where they're eligible to work with an interventionist. And I think that's also a bit of a struggle as well at times.
Yeah, so to piggyback on what you just said, Jerry, yeah, I do think it needs to be in both places. You need to have persons trained for your reading specialist area, with those kids as well as your special ed. Because you're right, you don't want everyone going, oh, I've got a dyslexic child, they need special education. Well, that's not going to work. Yeah. Good conversation. I appreciate your questions and all the input too. Anyone else before we hop off for the night?
Kelly, I'll add one more thing. Because not all of those students qualify, what we have tried to do is get our reading coaches who are supporting our teachers around literacy to take a stronger look at, sorry, I have cats tussling in the background. We have those here too. To take a stronger look at how we can strengthen that part of our instruction as a piece within the general classroom.
Yeah, at the universal level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a big conversation too. What's interesting is total transparency. I published a curriculum that, Silver Moon Spelling Rules is my curriculum. And I didn't set out to publish a curriculum. I really set out to make some activities and worksheets for teachers. And I found that it needed to be sequential and logical. So I packaged it together. And to make a long story short, oh goodness, where am I going with this? I made the materials, the curriculum for students in special ed. But it's been out for 7 years now. I just released the third book, and there is an equal amount of teachers in the general ed that are using it as there are in special ed, as there are in, I've got teachers in gifted and talented as well, in ELL classes. But the universal population has been really surprising and really relieving too, right? Because we do want these strategies to get into our general ed classrooms and maybe prevent issues from happening in the first place. Okay, well, I think that's a wrap. So I'll send this out to everyone. Thank you for being here this evening after your long day at work. And next week we'll get into methods and strategies and all that fun stuff. So I look forward to next week. Everyone have a good night. Hey, Jerry, if you, here, I'm just gonna send you a message here. I do appreciate your jumping in. I'm not in a district anymore, so it's always helpful to get, that district perspective. So super helpful. We should do one of these together.
Yeah, well, we certainly it was part of giving feedback related to the dyslexia guidebook process with DPI, because I was involved with our state organization at that time.